Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. Papa Boris here, playing some more chess, and I couldn't move on without doing another game by Mikhail Chigorin. He was such a great player and also a great personality. He was actually an orphan. I don't know if you know much about the late 1800s, but it wasn't a great time to be an orphan, so he managed to rise up from that and become one of the world's best chess players. Now, in this game, he was white against another great player, Alapin, and Alapin was a strong player in St. Petersburg around the turn of the century. He wasn't like a top player in the world, but he did have wins against some really strong players like Tarash and Chigorin himself in other games, actually. But in this game, spoiler alert, Chigorin got the better of him. Let's see how he did it. So after e4 and e5, knight f3 and knight c6, we have the Italian game, and Alapin chose to play bishop to c5, which allowed for the always exciting Evans gambit. And after the bishop takes, white gets to play c3 with tempo and expand in the center with d4. Now Chigorin here elected for the slower approach to the Evans gambit. He actually castled first, and then after knight to f6, pushed the pawn in the middle. This allows black to play knight takes e4 in response to the pawn advance. If the knight were on g8, and white had played d4 a turn earlier, this wouldn't have been possible. So now we get into a pretty sharp variation, and by the way, the engine likes black's position here, so that was one of the trademark features of Chigorin's games. What he did wasn't really all that sound, yet somehow he managed to win anyway and be one of the world's best players while doing it. So after d takes e5, there is the option by black to actually take on c3. This pawn has two attackers and only a single defender. So that's a possibility. If you take with the knight here, this actually ends up being better for white after queen to b3. This forks the knight and also this pawn on f7. If you take with the bishop, then we can get a similar situation. After knight takes, queen b3 is even better for white, according to the engine, than in the other variation. But basically, black can't really get anything out of taking on c3. So in this case, Chigorin's disregard for material, letting this pawn hang, is actually valid. But Alapin was a strong player. He didn't take that pawn. He knew it would be a mistake, so he just castled here. And then here, white played bishop to d5, attacking this knight on e4 and basically asking, what are you going to do with this knight? And here, Alapin chose to take on c3. This is actually now an exchange sacrifice, because Chigorin plays bishop takes e4, allowing black to take the rook on a1. And according to the engine, black is way better here. Just like, no, not even close. Like, it's definitely a better position for black. But if you let the engine sit and think about the position more, then actually the engine comes back with the evaluation that this is totally equal. So this is a fairly deep move by Chigorin. It's something the engine doesn't really like, but in the end, the engine comes around to saying, well, at least white is equal, even though he's down the exchange and two pawns. Now, Chigorin most likely did this interesting maneuver with his bishop on c4, going to d5 and taking on e4, and allowing black to take the rook on a1, so that he could play this sacrifice, bishop takes h7. Now, this is a pretty common theme in chess. You sacrifice the bishop, then you come to g5 with check, and then you play queen h5. The problem here with this sacrifice is that although black can't stop the checkmate on h7 and attempts to move the rook away actually lead to a very thematic finish. You see this in a fair number of variations with the bishop to h7 sacrifice. Now, when the rook moves to make way for the king, it drops defense of f7. So white can play queen takes f7 check, king to h8, and then after queen to h5 and king to g8, it's the exact same position as before, only now the f7 pawn is missing. And this allows white to play queen to h7 check, drive the king to f8, and after the king comes to e7, queen takes g7 is checkmate. This sort of pattern with the bishop sack on h7, the knight coming to g5, and the queen coming to h5 to give this checkmate, first coming to f7 and then popping back to h7, it has appeared in other games of chess in other positions, and maybe this is what Simeon Alapin was afraid of would happen back here when white sacked the bishop on h7. But interestingly, this is actually black's best defense, and the idea is that after knight to g5 and the king goes back and queen to h5, you actually sacrifice your queen for the knight here. Notice what's happened is that black here has a rook and a piece for the queen, which is usually not enough compensation, but black also has an extra pawn. And, the development, you can say, is not necessarily in black's favor, But after black, for example, takes on e5, black's pieces are pretty well guarded, so black will have time to make some developing moves, get this bishop out, get this rook over somewhere. And it's definitely a playable game. Black does have two connected passed pawns here, and white doesn't really have an attack anymore. This would have been the best defense possible for black, but perhaps Simeon Alapin didn't want to sacrifice his queen, or maybe he didn't evaluate correctly the position after the queen sacrifice, or maybe he just thought he could beat white if he went to king h8. But the problem is that this move actually gives white the advantage. So now after knight to g5, Simeon Alapin might have thought he was safe with g6, stopping the queen from coming to h5. If you don't take the bishop on h7, that is sometimes a way to get around the tactics of the sacrifice, because it prevents knight to g5 from coming with tempo. What Alapin missed, however, is that now white has a definite advantage. It's not like a winning attack immediately, but white plays queen to g4 here, and it's totally fine for white to just slowly get over with this queen and start threatening to checkmate the king. Now at this point, black has to take this pawn on e5 with the knight or with the bishop. And it's kind of difficult to tell which one's better. If you take with the bishop guards these squares. Whereas if you take with the knight, then the knight guards these squares. So in this corner here, you're going to be able to guard two of the squares. The question is, which two are the important two? Alapin chose to take with the bishop. And at this point, Darth Vader showed up and let him know that he had chosen poorly, because this does lose the game. If you go knight takes e5, white has the advantage, but it is still fighting game. There's still some fight in it left for black. With the bishop takes, white's attack becomes lethal. So Chigorin plays queen to h4, threatening to drop back with the bishop and provide checkmate. One of the only ways really to defend at all against this, maybe even the only way, is to play king to g7 and try to run the king out so that the bishop move is not a discovered check. But here, Alapin probably missed an amazing tactic by Chigorin, who played knight to e6 check. Now the idea behind this check is that the knight doesn't actually really matter. The knight was just in the way on g5. The point is to move the knight with tempo and free up the bishop on c1 to attack the c6 square so that white's queen can come here and give check and continue the attack. The fact that the knight can be taken by two different pawns is irrelevant, because it doesn't actually, the point of this move is not to break through the position. A lot of sacrifices are done to clear out some pawns and make way for access to the king. This is not one of those sacrifices. Here, it's just to get the piece out of the way with tempo so that white can continue the attack. Now, there's two different ways to take this knight. If you take with the d-pawn, then white has queen to g6 check. There's no running back to the corner because you're getting mated. So the only way out is forward to f6. But after king to f6, there is bishop to g5 check, picking up black's queen. So seeing this, perhaps Alapin decided not to go in for this line, and instead he chose to take with the f-pawn. This allows the black king to go to f7 and avoid getting pinned to the queen by the bishop from the f6 square. Unfortunately for black, this move does result in a forced mate, but it would be taking some credit away from Chigorin just to say, oh, it's a forced mate for white here, because white has to play very carefully, and a single mistake ends the game. For example, if white had played bishop to h6 check, suddenly now black can just play king to f7, and there's no more useful checks for white, and at this point, black is just totally winning. So you can't just, sit back, rest on your laurels, and saunter on down to easy street. You have to know what you're doing here. Chigorin found the right move, queen to h6 check. Now, as we talked about before, going to h8, you get mated. Going to f6, you lose your queen. So Alapin went to f7. And here again, you have to play carefully. If you're just casually taking queen to g6, you're going to lose the game. Because after bishop to e7, there's really nothing that white can do to continue the attack. If white tries bishop to g5, then the king can actually run to d6. So for example, bishop to f6, bishop takes, rook takes, and after queen g7 check, just run to d6, and yeah, you're getting out of it scot-free, basically. This is a more or less equal position. So you can't go bishop g5, and if you go bishop to a4, black has this very simple move here, d6, and now the king can just run into this corner, and the bishop on e5 ends up being beautiful, stopping the white queen from checking on g7. So you have to be very careful. It's not queen to g6 that you do here, but you actually do bishop takes g6. Now, if the king goes to g8, once again, this will just be checkmate right away. And if the king goes to f6, this is actually checkmate. Forget winning the queen, that's just mate. So the king only has one move, which is to go to e7. And again, here you have to be very, very careful. If you play queen to h7, then the king runs to d6. And after bishop to a3 check, black has this resource, knight to b4. After bishop takes the knight, you play c5, and all of a sudden, here, black is up the exchange, and the king is just going to hide behind the pawn on c6, or maybe in some cases even run all the way back to b8 and be totally safe. And this is an equal position. So you can't play queen to h7 check. You have to play the much more precise queen to h4 check. See, now if the king runs to d6 and you go bishop to a3, the knight b4 resource doesn't work because the queen, which is ingeniously moved here, can actually take the knight. And now black has 3 different ways to respond to this check. He can move the king to c6, or to d5, or push the pawn to block it, but no matter which move black chooses, white's next move is to place the queen on c5 and deliver checkmate. So the king can't run to d6. Here, black blocks the check with rook f6. And again, I can't stress this enough. You can't just go queen to h7 because, again, the king's running to d6 here, and then the attack is over. So what you have to do is play bishop to a3 check first. There's no trickery here blocking with the knight, because if you do, black just takes the knight and you're in the same situation as before. So no matter what happens, you have to either block with the bishop on d6 or with the pawn on d6. And Alapin chose the pawn, but it makes no difference because the whole point of this check was not to mate the king immediately, but just to force a piece to occupy the d6 square. And so now you go queen to h7, and the king cannot run to d6. So here we have a little bit of a squirreling away as the white queen gets ever closer to the king. Finally, there's no more moves for the black king. The rook is forced to interpose, but then queen takes f7 is checkmate. Hope you enjoyed that game. Please like and or subscribe if you did, and I'll see you again soon for some more chess.